It's great looking at, seeing so many people here. This is wonderful. So thank you everybody for coming to our Windham World Affairs annual fundraiser. I'm Tamara Sten, I'm chairperson of the board, and I'm just going to go over a couple of details before we bring our speakers up here and have the night's events begin. Make sure that you silence your cell phones. Okay, if you haven't done that already, you can turn your cell phones off. We have Scott is here, who's also one of our board members at Windham World Affairs. And Scott's here to help if you need help with bathrooms, water, anything like that. Scott's going to be here to help out with any of those things. So other members of Windham World Affairs, we have our Lissa Weinman, who I think you've seen when you walked in, right at the back. Hi, Lissa. We have Claire Morgana Gillis, also, who is in the front lobby. Scott Cooper, Star Electronica, who's at the library, not able to join us right now. Jim Kirby. Yay. Oh, Star's here. Yay, hi Star. Jim Kirby and Paul Love. So all of us have been working hard this whole year to bring you guys really quality programming. I also want to recognize our wonderful administrator, Susan Healy, who I think is in the back getting all the food ready. Yeah, Susan's an amazing caterer and also organizer, and she's been really great at helping to connect us with the high school, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit too. I also want to thank all of the many small business owners who value this organization's work and have contributed generously to tonight's raffle. Okay, so we have some amazing raffle gifts, right? We're going to have a chance to purchase more raffle tickets after this event if you're thinking, oh my goodness, you know, I really want to get that stuff, or I really want to support Windham World Affairs programming, there'll be more of a chance. Tonight is really special because we've been working for the past year to develop a new and improved Windham World Affairs Council. I'm just going to go over a couple of our highlights. So we've honored and built upon a 62-year foundation whose founders and members have included great thinkers and doers like economist John Kenneth Galbraith and environmentalist Arthur Westing. We've also strengthened the organization to welcome all points of view, and that's a really important part to what we do. Today's members include Nobel Peace Laureate Jody Williams, Peter Galbraith, and folks like Dorothy Porter of Jerusalem Peace Builders and Chuck Collins, one of the nation's best minds tackling how growing inequality is impacting our democracy, and one of his books is also one of our prizes, so thank you, Chuck. We're also always seeking to widen perspectives within our membership, so please consider joining as a member if you haven't already done so. You'll be in good company. WWAC presents great monthly events free of charge and open to all, and will continue to do so. Moving forward, we're going to be focused more on China, okay? Understanding that other great nation, which is so essential. And on October 20th, mark your calendars, at 6:30, we're going to have Smith College professor Dr. Sarah Newland present at a discussion called U.S. and China from Old Friends to the New Cold War. Okay, we'll have flyers outside about that too. So that's our next event, okay, October 20th. And that's going to take place at 118 Elliott, which is kind of right around the corner, across from the firehouse. We revamped our board to include those with a diverse portfolio of experience, and we're always interested in finding new board members. So if you're interested, let us know. Okay, we have a new website too, and there's information about our current board on that website. We've also added monthly salons, 6 p.m. the fourth Wednesday of every month, so you can put that in your calendar. Members can make new friends and gather at 118 Elliott for wine, cheese, deeper conversations, and networking. And you're also able to join our monthly board meetings. We have a lot of fun, but we get work done. 4:45 to 5:45 before the salons. Okay, so come early, you can be in the board meeting, or just come for the salon, and we welcome all participation. We've launched Peace Jam at the high school, which is a new program. And that's helping to boost one of our most important functions, connecting local youth to members who can give them a leg up in creating a better world and providing material support for them, and the wonderful teachers at BUHS. And Peace Jam is put together by the Nobel laureates, people that have won the Nobel laureates, and it's a national organization. And we had some high school students from Peace Jam here helping to set up and get this event together today, so big thanks for that. Okay, we've modernized our website, we've broadened our appeal so we can broaden the diversity of our membership, make it more interesting and representative of our community at large. I spent several years working at Landmark College and brought in a lot of accessibility to our ways of communicating with people. So we'll always have online options and videos that have text, ways that we have accessibility for all different types of learners and communicators. We're strengthening our ties and participation to the broader National World Affairs Council, and that promotes a global way of thinking in a way that we could never do on our own, right? We're the Windham World Affairs, but we're part of the National World Affairs Council all throughout the United States. And that helps us to expand our access to great discussions happening at other councils and contributes to our understanding and action on pressing global issues. Almost done. Tonight, we are thrilled to announce a new initiative, brand new. We're just on a call with this today. It's called America 250. And it's examining America's identity and leadership in a changing world. And what we're looking at is the 250th anniversary of the United States, of the forming of the United States. It's going to be celebrated in 2026, and we're already starting to plan content for that. Peter Galbraith's lecture tonight will help us sharpen the way that we look at this new initiative. Right, it's not just colonists coming to the United States, right? There's more to it than that. And we're going to hope to provoke a lot of feedback from you as we start developing this. Working with Brooks Memorial Library, Meg Mott, and others and around Brattleboro, we aim over the next 2 years to hold a series of events that look back and examine what the United States has meant in the world. And most importantly, we're going to look forward to discuss who are we as citizens in the United States going to be in this rapidly changing world. A world where diplomacy and international understanding is more important than ever, as we have to act quickly and together to secure our planet's ability to sustain us all, right? And that's what Windham World Affairs Council is all about, bringing in educated discussion, right? Informed ways of looking at things. And to do this, we rely on the support of you, the community, through your membership dues and contributions. We're part of an ecosystem that supports our small businesses that also help us. So please buy raffle tickets, right, for a chance to win. And if you haven't already, you can get them afterwards. What we'll be doing is I'll be introducing Meg Mott, who's going to be speaking, and then we have Peter Galbraith here as well. We'll have an audience question and answer where you can all participate. And after all of that, we have some refreshments and snacks in the back room and another chance to purchase those raffle tickets. What I want to do now is introduce Meg Mott. Okay, Meg calls herself a Constitution Wrangler, and that's a role that she's wrought over the past few years in her award-winning Debating Our Rights lectures that's enjoyed by audience throughout the Northeast. Meg taught constitutional law and political theory at Marlborough College for 20 years and participates in town government in Putney. She cares deeply about our country, the rule of law, free speech, and is actively working to bring civic responsibilities to the fore as we approach our country's 250th anniversary. She will share some thoughts about that and introduce Ambassador Galbraith, who will speak for about a half an hour and then take questions. Okay? We will draw raffle winners at the end of our reception, so stick around, and if you're not able to stick around, make sure you put your name on your raffle ticket, so if we draw it, we can contact you. So without further ado, please welcome Meg Mott.
Hi everybody, I'm Meg Mott. I'm the Constitution Wrangler, and somehow I left the house without my Constitution. So we'll hope that we know enough of it by heart. And anyway, let's get real. This is a 250th anniversary. This is not going back to 1787, this is going back to 1776, and we didn't even have a constitution in 1776. So who needs a constitution? I just need to silence my phone. Okay, I got that. So I really appreciate this invitation, because I used to be on the Windham World Affairs Council back in the day I recognize some of the lovely people in the audience who were on the council when I was. Marcia, Javed, Arthur Westing is no longer with us. Mark Schleffer, no longer with us. But that's how it is when you commemorate. We have our people, and then they're here, and then they're not here. This one is a very interesting commemoration coming up. Semiquincentennial. I had to practice that. Semiquincentennial. That means half of 500. Si tú hablas español, sabes que 500, 500. Semi-500 is 250. So you take 250 minus 2026, and we come up with a very heavy dose of 1776. So 1776, just a short reminder, we were not a sovereign nation. There was no constitution, there was no Bill of Rights. We were an idea put forth by a cadre of lawyers, petitioners, making a case against tyranny in the global court of public opinion. Like any debater enthused with ethos, these guys established their authority through carefully chosen words. And here's the beginning of a very long sentence. I'm not going to get the whole sentence out in my 7 minutes. But it begins with a very noble idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it keeps going. Although, because of a printer error early on, somebody put a period right after that first happiness, as if that was it. Then there's this dash, so you know it's not the end of the sentence. It's just the beginning. We've got these noble ideas, liberty and equality, that to secure these truths, government is instituted. So we have these liberties, which are vaguely defined but unalienable. And then we, who don't have a government yet, say we need a government. And that the whole point of the government is to secure these liberties. And then it gets very interesting. I used to be able to say this with an easy heart. But in the last couple of years, it's a little harder to get to this part of the Declaration and not need a smelling salt. And that is, it says that once that government is instituted to protect our rights, if we don't like it, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. That's what it says in the Declaration. As a people, a self-generating entity, a group that creates its authority through its own words, it includes, infused with unalienable rights. So it's a pretty great group, these people. We also have the right to take up arms under certain conditions. And most of the Declaration is about what are the conditions to rise up in rebellion. And it has to do with a king or a government misbehaving in terms of political rule. Criminal procedure is enormous, and starting to behave like a tyrant. And if the government is a tyrant, we do not have to obey. So, the Declaration is about two things. It's about ideals, and then it's about violence. That's what we're commemorating. Besides liberty and equality, we have the people's right to rise up against the government. So when these words are put out in 1776, don't think that a lot of people weren't paying attention. On the 15th anniversary of the Declaration, we might call that the quinceanera, Toussaint Louverture successfully led a slave rebellion in Haiti. Now, the people who wrote the Declaration were like, oops. However, they also knew that this is what those words could mean. Because there was a part of the Declaration that said, one of the things the king has done so badly is he's brought slavery to our shores. And the other people who are writing the Declaration go, good point, but what does that mean about us? So they got rid of that part. But it wasn't as if they didn't know. So, slave rebellion happens in Haiti and it's successful. John Brown, in 1859, takes the Declaration to heart and attacks Harper's Ferry And he's got it in his heart, and he's got it on his way to the gallows when he's executed for treason. Lincoln uses the Declaration at Gettysburg in 1863 in a very violent circumstance. There's a lot of blood on the ground in Gettysburg, and he uses the Declaration to try and make sense of it all. And then, this is my favorite, I don't know, maybe because I'm from the 70s and people used to smoke on television. This is my favorite example of the Declaration. 1973, close to the bicentennial, Huey Newton, then the leader of the Black Panther Party, asks William F. Buckley, who was then the host of Firing Line, which side of the revolution would William Buckley have been on? A friend of mine wants to know, is what Huey Newton says. And then he takes a drag on his cigarette. You can see this on YouTube. It's just beautiful. And Buckley, to his credit, he takes this question very, very seriously. He pauses and he says, I think I would have fought on the side of the revolutionaries. As revolutions go, it was pretty humane. And Newton responds, I'll tell my friend, you're not such a bad guy after all. So that's his whole legacy in the Declaration, ideals and willing to fight, violence. The Panthers put this whole sentence in their 10-point program. But there's another way of thinking about the Declaration. Right after it was written, before the first anniversary, Prince Hall, the leader of the African Lodge in Massachusetts, used the principles in the Declaration to petition the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or the Massachusetts General Court, for an end to slavery, and his petition succeeds. So you can use the Declaration without violence and have success. Martin Luther King Jr. also ran with the ideals but not the violence. Instead of sacrificing oneself on the battlefield, he asked his fellow protesters to engage in self-purification. If you're not ready to be spat at, if you're not ready to eschew violence when violence is forced upon you, then don't attend today's march. Violence will be there, but our commitment to the ideals of liberty and equality are such that we will sacrifice ourselves rather than betray them through violence. King loved the Declaration. That and the Emancipation Proclamation were his guiding lights. He skipped the section on armed rebellion in the Declaration, and he jumped both feet on the ground to the final phrase of that sentence. The sentence that begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that involves armed rebellion. It ends with an obligation of the people to institute a new government. Can't just stay in rebellion land. Laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So that's the nonviolent approach. I would call it the constitutional approach. That's why I'm the Constitution Wrangler, not the Declaration Wrangler. It's the let's put down our weapons and start organizing ourselves approach. But these are ongoing questions. Does violence need to protect liberty? Must we fight in order to secure equality and liberty? In May of this year, the Oxford Debating Union addressed this very issue as a matter of U.S. foreign policy. The proposition was, this House would fight for democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law abroad. Ambassador John Bolton argued for the affirmative. Ambassador Peter Galbraith for the negative. Each side presented evidence for their claims. Each side rebutted their opponents. Both sides were heard. The final tally was 72 in favor of the proposition and 150 against. Well done, Peter. Tonight we are lucky to have Peter Galbraith here to present his side of this important debate. Peter was the U.S. ambassador to Croatia in the 1990s and Vermont state senator in the 2010s. Many of us have had the pleasure of hearing Peter speak at the annual Galbraith Lecture, an event that goes back to John Kenneth Galbraith in the dawning days of Windham World Affairs. As a clan, the Galbraiths are famous for asking audiences to think beyond conventional wisdom. In fact, I think that's a term that John Kenneth Galbraith coined, conventional wisdom. To think beyond easy affirmations, because don't we all go out of an evening in order to have our beliefs affirmed? But no, that's not what the Windham World Affairs Council does. The point is to go out of an evening and hear information that challenges your beliefs. That has always been the function of the Windham World Affairs Council. So, be prepared tonight to wrangle with these perplexing issues. When does the protection of liberty and equality in other countries call for violence? How should we organize our own house to improve the safety and happiness at home? What would a non-violent approach to confronting tyranny look like? These are some of the questions that we'll be wrestling with tonight. So as Tamara suggested, Peter is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll give you, the people, a chance to wrangle with these perplexing questions. One way to warm up for the semi-quincentennial celebration. Welcome, Peter Galbraith.
Thank you, Meg, for that terrific warm-up. I think probably I will be saying some things that will challenge the constitutional wrangler. I also want to thank Jesse for the wonderful pre-warm-up, the non-controversial part of the evening. And Tamara for her comments and for her leadership, and everybody else, friends here in the audience over many years. This is a wonderful institution. One of my gigs in my post-diplomatic life has involved being a lecturer on various tours and cruises for Harvard University. You can see that it's possibly not the most rigorous thing I've done, but one of them involved was the person who, of the guests, was the leader of the World Affairs Council. So I mentioned that I was from Windham County, and it was like, yeah, the Windham World Affairs Council, it's the smallest World Affairs Council in the United States. I mean, consider, even here in Vermont, there's the Vermont World Affairs Council and the Windham World Affairs Council. No other county has a World Affairs Council. And that is just because the extraordinary community that we have, which was when my father spoke at the beginning. You know, this is where the Peace Corps began its initial training. In Dummerston. And of course there's the Experiment in International Living, and so many, the School for International Training. This has been a very international place, and that is one of the many reasons why when I was asked in preparation for an article, where was my favorite place to go, I said Vermont, and really what I meant was Windham County. I want to, but the topic of the lecture is the end of the American century. Can the United States still lead the world, and should the United States still lead the world? You know, and I want to reflect back to the 1990s. I'm not going all the way back to 1776, and your mathematical calculations get a little beyond me. But just going back to the 1990s, which looking at this audience, I know almost everybody will remember. Just consider where the United States stood in the world in those days. In 1990, where the U.S. stood and where American values were, democracy, human rights. In 1990, the first free elections were held, and throughout Eastern Europe, the Iron Curtain had fallen the year before, beginning with events in Poland, and then the breaching of the Berlin Wall, Hungary dismantling it, the revolution in Romania, and then free elections were held, beginning in East Germany, and I was an observer for those. It was so fantastic. I remember being up in Rostock on the huge rally the day before the elections, and Willy Brandt, who had been the chancellor, and actually part of the resistance to the Nazis. He'd gone to Norway and become a Norwegian citizen during World War II, and fought against the Nazis and come back. And he looked out over this huge crowd, and I can remember his speech. He began by saying, there's some people we have to thank. We have to thank the Americans. It was because of them. They made this moment possible. And the crowd just cheered. And then he said, we also have to recognize Gorbachev. The crowd booed, but he said, no, without Gorbachev, this wouldn't have happened. Because it isn't always all about us. We think it is. We didn't actually win the Cold War. Some other people had a hand in it as well. And then he looked out, and there were lots of German flags, some of the West German, mostly West German, but some East German, which had a hammer and a compass, and then was surrounded by sheaves of wheat, which is a very communist symbol. He said, ich liebe diese Farbe. I love these colors, aber ohne die Gemüse, without the vegetables. But it was such a moment. And then 1991, the Soviet Union, our rival through the entire Cold War, a country where there were times, the Cuban Missile Crisis, some accidental events, where it looked like each of these countries with 50,000 nuclear weapons could not only wipe each other's out, but wipe out life on the planet. The Soviet Union, on December 25th, 1991, disappeared. In the middle of the 90s, 1994, South Africa, which had been this bastion of racism and apartheid, it had a peaceful transition to democracy and to majority rule. Indonesia, at the end of the decade, overthrew the Suharto dictatorship. And elsewhere, democracy spread. So basically, in the 90s, every country in the Western Hemisphere was a democracy. And as was every country in Europe, there were some problems. In Croatia and Bosnia, and later in Kosovo, and those were the places very much involved me. But still, the overall picture was just phenomenal. Now, there were, and Madeleine Albright could speak. I always thought it was a bit arrogant of the United States as the indispensable nation. But as Willy Brandt's words suggested, the United States had so much with the results of that time. And the United States, it was preeminent. As I said, the Soviet Union was gone. Yeah, there was China, and it was a rising power. But in the year 2000, China's GNP was about $1 trillion. The United States was a little bit over 10 trillion. So it was 10 times that of China. Today, the figures are 25 trillion for the US, 18 trillion for China, and sometime, probably in the next 10 years, China will pass the US in total GNP. Per capita, we're obviously still a lot better off. Not only was China, though, a much lesser power in the world, but its leadership was very badly shaken by the events in Tiananmen Square and the pro-democracy movement in China. And domestically, well, we could entertain ourselves with the foibles of our President Bill Clinton in the Oval Office with some intern. But otherwise, the country was in great shape. Imagine this. We had budget surpluses. In fact, the budget surpluses in the final years of the 1990s were so significant that we were on track to eliminate the national debt by 2009. And that posed a problem because the way in which the money supply is regulated is by the Federal Reserve, which issues treasury bonds. Well, if there's no debt, there's no treasuries, and that makes it harder. But that was the kind of problem that we would have had to deal with. And in terms of security, the U.S. was certainly preeminent militarily, but perhaps most significantly, in the 90s, we undertook steps to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, these had reached 50,000 nuclear warheads for the United States and maybe a somewhat smaller number for the Soviet Union. We reduced them to about 1,000 for the United States and for the Soviet Union, or for the successor states to the Soviet Union, because we went out under the non-Lugar legislation and dismantled their weapon systems. Those countries, so Russia was broke. So it was our money, the best money we ever invested in national security, which was dismantling Soviet nuclear warheads. In terms of nuclear proliferation, the number of nuclear states in the 1990s went down. Now, it's true, India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons in the 1990s, confirming what was already true, which is that they had them. But the United States, but North Korea, which had been moving in toward nuclear weapons, was constrained by the U.S. agreement with the DPRK, in which it was agreed that the U.S. and Japan and South Korea would provide a light water reactor, which can't be used for nuclear weapons, in return for North Korea dismantling its nuclear facilities. And the North Koreans agreed to a freeze on their missile development at the end of the 1990s. South Africa confessed to having a nuclear program, and as it dismantled apartheid, it got rid of it. It turned out Sweden had a nuclear program. It owned up and got rid of that. Iraq, of course, this was under Saddam. It didn't have nuclear weapons, as we should have known or did know. And then 3 countries that did have nuclear weapons because of the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, agreed to give up those weapons. And then, from the American security point of view, another point is that in the 1990s, the United States really had no significant enemies. Imagine that. Russia, under Yeltsin, he came to the United States and he said, we don't just want to be friends, we want to be your ally. As I said, relations with China were good. There were some minor hostile states, Iraq, which was very much constrained by sanctions, Iran, and North Korea, but there were openings both to Iran and North Korea. The Iranian President Khatami was progressive, at least in the terms of the Iranian system, and he was preaching the idea that Iran was tolerant of all religions and points of view. And there were meant to be exchanges that didn't just quite work out with the U.S. for essentially political reasons in Iran. And North Korea, again, there was an opening to North Korea. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, actually went to North Korea at the end of the Clinton administration. There was even discussion of President Clinton going there. And finally, one of the problems that has bedeviled the world, and this I can't go into every example, But there was even a major advance in the Middle East with peace between Jordan and Israel and the Oslo Accords, 30 years old, I think this next week, between Israel and the Palestinians. So that's where we were in the 1990s. I don't think I need to suggest that things aren't as wonderful today. And so the question is, what happened to the American century? And let me just say a word about what was the American century. If you think of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was already the world's largest economy. It was already a place of invention and innovation, as it was to be throughout the entire century. At the beginning, it was the place where manned flight began. It's where the automobile began. And so much of modern society, as it was at the end with the technology companies of the internet and the 90s, the internet and cell phones and all that sort of stuff. But internationally, it was really World War I, which the United States won. Wasn't the most important combatant in terms of manpower and certainly not casualties, but it tipped the balance. And it was the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who transformed World War I from a struggle among empires into a noble cause with his 14 points defining the objectives of the war to create a liberal democratic world order, the right of self-determination for peoples, democracy, and an international organization to enforce the rules. And then the U.S. implemented the multinational states in Europe, that is to say the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, essentially dissolved into national states, and new countries emerged: Hungary, Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Those latter two, later in the 90s, were of course to break up into, they were multinational states, break up into national states. Now, Woodrow Wilson, to be clear, was a racist of the first order, and he didn't extend the concept of self-determination to Asians or Africans, but the message, just as incidentally, Meg, you read about the Declaration of Independence, the guy who wrote it, Thomas Jefferson, was a slave owner and a rapist. Let's be blunt. But those words, nonetheless, were inspirational. And just as Wilson, also a racist, his ideas about self-determination led to the end of colonialism in an incredibly short period of time. It was 27 years from the Versailles Treaty to India-Pakistan becoming independent. 34 years for the French possessions in Indochina to go, and just 40 years, 40 to 50 years, all in a lifetime of somebody who could have been attending the Versailles Peace Conference, that African colonies became independent. And of course, the American century was first based on the League of Nations. And that began the other part of the American century, the other feature, which is the extraordinary number of self-inflicted wounds, or the number of wounds that we inflict on ourselves. There was agreement about the League of Nations. Wilson gave up a lot in Versailles to get that. And then it was rejected by the US Senate. It got a majority in the Senate, but it needed 2/3 by Henry Cabot Lodge, who basically, for partisan political reasons, wanted to deny Woodrow Wilson his great achievement. And I walked by, I think the day before yesterday, the Massachusetts State House, and there's a statue of John F. Kennedy, and then behind I could see, oh, wait a minute, that's a statue of Henry Cabot Lodge. Well, that guy, you know, I'm not sure he deserves a statue. I mean, he is significantly responsible for World War II and for millions and millions of deaths. But okay, more on the American century, just briefly. It continues, then you get to World War II, where the United States was absolutely the decisive participant, and it emerges from the war basically undamaged, and in 1945 it has about over 50% of the GNP of the world. It creates the United Nations, which it then signs up for. The United Nations is created in what city? San Francisco. And where is it headquartered? New York. Which is just having the United States is such a big advantage. The League was in Geneva, but this is in New York. France and Britain are eclipsed into irrelevance. Japan and Germany were destroyed. The only real rival was the Soviet Union, and of course we've discussed what happened in the 1990s. But why is the world so different in 2023 than it was in the American century? And especially the American century that it had such a crescendo at the end of the 20th century. Well, there are a few points. Excuse me. First, Russia was not always going to be down. China's rise was always inevitable, even though its GNP in 2000 was 1/10 of the United States. Its rate of growth was so rapid that the effect of multiplication was really boosting it. And then there was some events the United States couldn't control, or maybe even just bad luck. For example, Boris Yeltsin represented a liberal Russia, but he was an alcoholic and erratic. And that paved the way for Putin. I have to say, I met Yeltsin once when he came to the United States. This was before he became president of Russia. He was the great hero among a certain community, and liberal community, and there was a party for him at a penthouse in Central Park West, and I came up. I was working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I arrived a little late at the party, and there was a man at the bar, and he had a water glass full of scotch and a water glass full of vodka, and I looked at him and I said, "Oh, you're planning to enjoy yourself." He says, "No, it's not for me, it's for chairman." And I watched Yeltsin drink both of those things. And shall I say, the speech was not possibly the most coherent. And then Xi in China has, it was always a dictatorship, but he managed in the principle of 2 terms for leaders, so he's a more difficult, different kind of dictator. The opportunities with Iran, with Khatami, they never quite managed a meeting of the minds. And in the case of Israel and the Palestinians, well, Rabin was assassinated, Labor lost power. It got back to power at the end of the Clinton administration. Clinton, in January of 2001, tried to broker a deal. With Rabin being assassinated, the Israelis weren't willing to broker a deal. In 2001, Arafat was ill. He wasn't willing to broker a deal. And then Bush came into office, and he wasn't interested in the U.S. playing that same role. But the end of the American century, there was bad luck. There were circumstances beyond U.S. control. But a huge part of the end of the American century was a product of multiple unforced errors, home goals, both internationally and domestically. Now, I could take up many hours discussing all of them, so I will I will be brief. But just to give a few examples internationally. In the case of Korea, the Bush folks didn't like the agreement with North Korea. It was far from perfect. It turned out the North Koreans were cheating, but cheating very slowly. And instead of dealing with that, George Bush gave a speech to the Congress. He denounced North Korea, Iran, along with Iraq as being part of an axis of evil, and the US withdrew from the agreed framework with no fallback plan. Now, none of this is to say North Korea is a good state. I'm only talking as a matter of strategy. This is not a moral judgment. But if you're going to take an action, you need to make sure it's going to accomplish the goal you want. You've declared that you will not let the world's most dangerous states have the world's most dangerous weapons. What happens? 2002, North Korea withdraws from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 2006, North Korea detonates a nuclear bomb. And what were the consequences? Basically none. So it was a lot of rhetoric to make you feel good, but it was actually damaging. It left the United States and the world worse off. In 2003, Iran, May 1st, 2003, after the US had entered Iraq, done the Iranians a huge favor. They'd spent 8 years trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein. The US did it in 3 weeks. And so they sent a quiet message through the Swiss to the United States. We want to solve the nuclear issue. We'd like to have better relations. And Dick Cheney took the response. He says, we don't negotiate with evil. And so again, this initiative was rejected. There was no backup plan. And what did Iran do? Well, it continued with some of its nuclear activities. But of course, the biggest unforced errors were the two wars of this century. First Afghanistan and then Iraq. Now, the war in Afghanistan began as a response to a terrorist attack out of Afghanistan on the United States, 9/11. And so it was a perfectly reasonable response when the Taliban refused to turn over al-Qaeda for the United States to take military action, and it did, and it was effective. What was it? It involved sending in special forces, some of them with a flair for the theatrical, were filmed on horseback, but that wasn't the principal way of getting around, to be with the Northern Alliance, an Afghan group that was resisting the Taliban, controlled a small area of Afghanistan, Panjshir Valley, Badakhshan, along with B-52 bombing raids. We entered in October of 2001, and the Taliban were gone by December of 2001. But instead of saying, okay, Northern Alliance, you are our partners, we're turning things over to you, you're an Afghans, you sort this thing out. The United States came in with a great deal of hubris and a huge amount of ignorance of Afghanistan. It created a constitution for the country, a country that is one of the most ethnically diverse in the world, geographically diverse, people divided from each other by mountains, and created a highly centralized state where all power was concentrated in Kabul, and within Kabul in the hands of the president. An insurgency occurred, and the United States adopted a counterinsurgency strategy when there was no partner. If David Petraeus, the author of that strategy, were here, he would say, the key feature to my counterinsurgency strategy is you have to have a local partner. Why? Because while NATO can come in and clear the insurgents out of an area, you can't stay there, so you need to have an Afghan army and police who can hold security. You need a government that can provide honest administration, provide economic benefits. Well, that just didn't exist. And the United States pursued this same strategy in Afghanistan, which didn't have the essential element for 20 years, and you know how it ended. I'd like to contrast, actually, the United States experience in Afghanistan with the Soviet experience. The Soviets invaded in '79, and they agreed to be out on the 15th of February 1989. Now, as it happened, I went to Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, on the 14th of February. And the Soviets got out one day early. They knew I was coming. A Soviet Major General, Gromov, was in the last vehicle of the last seat of the last armored vehicle crossing the bridge into the Soviet Union, across the Oxus River. The Soviet-installed puppet regime, as we called it, lasted another 3 years. It lasted a year longer than the Soviet Union. Contrast that to the American experience. $2 trillion, hundreds of billions given to build up an Afghan military. The United States agreed under the Trump deal to be out by the 31st of August, 2021. The Taliban took Kabul 2 weeks before, on the 15th of August 2021. And the US then finished its withdrawal one day early, and who was the last guy out? Why, it was an American Major General. I think they no sense of history. Now, that was Afghanistan. We could talk about Iraq. Suffice it to say, the United States went into Iraq. You could say that the goal of the mission was to make sure that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and since he didn't have them to begin with, you could say that it was mission accomplished. But the cost was $3 trillion, 5,000 Americans killed, and maybe another 20 or 30,000, whose lives were very much wrecked because they were the casualties. That if it had been the kind of medicine that existed in World War I, the casualties would have been 4 or 5 times higher. But the enduring effects for those people were huge. The end result was Iraq actually did have free and fair elections, and the winners were Shiite religious parties that were founded in Iran, that were Iran's closest allies in the world, along with the Kurds winning, and they didn't want to have an Iraq at all. You could say, and I do actually, that for most Iraqis, most of them being Kurds or Shiites, the results were very good. The question was it worth $3 trillion for the United States and the loss of life and the damage to our reputation? So, a couple of huge unforced errors that took place in the first 2 decades of this century internationally. But we don't need to look to foreign policy to see the reasons for the end of the American century. We could start with the United States. To remind, I pointed out that at the end of the 20th century, the United States not only had budget surpluses, but was on track to eliminate the entire national debt. Well, and that would have made it difficult for the Federal Reserve to manage the money supply. George W. Bush took care of that problem. He cut taxes and greatly increased spending on these various wars. And instead of having surpluses, we had ever-growing debt. In the Obama years, the deficit declined, but the debt kept growing because there was still deficit. And then in the Trump years, there was another huge round of tax cuts, of spending increases. So the national debt, which was on track at the end of the 20th century to be zero, is now $33 trillion. But the economic issues are frankly very little compared to what I see as the crisis of American democracy. Now, as you know, I served as the first U.S. ambassador to Croatia, which had been part of Yugoslavia. It was a communist country. And part of my job as the American ambassador was to give lectures on democracy. I'm so glad I did it in the 1990s because I would be embarrassed to have that job today. There are 2 essential features for a successful democracy. And they don't exist in the United States. The first is an independent judiciary that can be relied on to settle political disputes in a nonpartisan manner. And second, major political parties that accept the result of elections that they lose. And frankly, neither of those things exist in the United States today. A defining feature of a nonpartisan judiciary would be this: faced with identical law and identical facts, a nonpartisan court will come to the same decision without regard to the political affiliation of the plaintiff and the defendant. I think almost everybody could say that would be fair. Wouldn't matter whether it was a Republican or Democrat. Whatever the law was and whatever the facts were, you get the same result. But that wasn't true of the US Supreme Court, as has been nakedly clear since the 5-4 decision to stop the 2000 Florida recount at a time that George Bush was a few hundred votes ahead of Al Gore. By freezing the incomplete recount, the court put Bush into the presidency. Now, no serious person believes that those 5 Republican Supreme Court members who stopped that recount would have done so had Gore been head of Bush. Right. And since 2000, so it simply failed the test of being an impartial arbiter. And since 2000, the Supreme Court has simply become more partisan, a more extreme right-wing, and more a political instrument of the Republican Party. Incidentally, the 4 justices who voted to continue the Florida recount, 2 were appointed by Democratic president and 2 by Republican president. And then, of course, there is January 6th. As bad as it was, the real scandal was not the assault on the US Capitol. The real scandal is that a majority of Republicans in Congress, that is to say, the majority of the Republicans who serve at the national level, elected, voted that day to overturn a free and fair election that Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. Right. And in 2020, American democracy was not saved by the courts or by the Congress, but rather by the incompetence of Donald Trump and his gangs of clowns like Rudy Giuliani. In 2024, the anti-democracy gang in America is certainly going to be better prepared. In the House of Representatives, all the Republicans, maybe all but one, who voted to uphold the 2020 elections, in other words, voted to accept Biden's victory, were opposed in primaries in 2022, or seeing the handwriting on the wall, chose not to run. And in the Senate, there's been nobody, no Republican, more committed to the idea of democracy than Mitt Romney. You know, hardly a liberal. And he's announced his retirement. He claims it's because of age. When you hear a politician saying they're leaving because of age or to spend more time in their family, you know it's for some other reason. Because he knows he'd have a hard time winning a Republican primary next year in Utah. So this crisis of American democracy reveals the underlying weaknesses of our institutions. And these institutions were created by the Constitution, by laws and the practice of 250 years. But we have to ask, do they still work? Leaving aside Bush v. Gore, we've had a series of Supreme Court decisions that have radically tried to reshape American life. Heller, expanding the definition of the Second Amendment, which had always been held not to be the right of an individual to take any gun anyplace, but the right of the people to a well-regulated militia, to being an individual right. Citizens United, which overturned laws that were passed on a bipartisan basis to regulate money in politics. And of course, the Dobbs decision on abortion. Now, when I was serving in the Vermont Senate, Lawrence Lessig, a Harvard academic, came to see me and others to promote the idea of having a constitutional convention, which could be called by, is it 2/3 of the states, Meg?
It's 2/3 of the states.
2/3 of the states, and then any amendments would have to be approved by 3/4. A lot of people, myself as well, felt it was a bit risky because how do it could be a runaway convention. But, and it's never been done. But you should know that how difficult it is to amend the Constitution, either that way, 2/3 of the states, 3/4 to propose and 3/4 to actually amend, or to do it the way it's been done, and very infrequently, basically only 16 times since the Constitution was adopted, and that is 2/3 of each House of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. But it turns out, and this isn't taught in law school, but it ought to be, there's a really easy way to change the Constitution, to amend the Constitution. What is that? Oh, change the court. Now, you could just enlarge it by law, or if the Democrats stay in power long enough, they can pack the court just the way the Republicans did. Let's say Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito get some qualm of conscience and they decide to resign over their unethical behavior. Joe Biden would be able to fill 2 seats. And what would happen? What do you suppose would happen in the confirmation hearing of the judges? The first question would be, where do you stand on Dobbs? And do you think they'd say, oh, well, we have to stick with Dobbs, it's precedent? No, they couldn't. They'd have to say Roe v. Wade was correct. So, if something happened to those 2 justices next week, and Biden had 2 new justices, all of a sudden the law of the United States on abortion would go right back to Roe v. Wade. Is that really law? Is that how it should be done? Is the Supreme Court just a political yo-yo? The answer is yes. And that would be true for Citizens United. That would be overturned, and Heller would be overturned. In short, by promoting an extreme agenda, and this has basically been what the Republican Party has done, they've made the judiciary into a partisan arena, perhaps even more partisan than the Congress. Why? Because actually the Congress does nothing. And so, this kind of judiciary just doesn't work, and it's not something that you can repair. And sadly, the way we choose judges is very different from other countries. In other democracies, judges are chosen in a professional manner, in a non-political manner. And it's not just incidentally on the federal level. In Wisconsin, judges are elected, as they are in many states. The gerrymandered Republican legislature, the Democrats actually got a majority of the votes for the state legislature, but it's so gerrymandered that it is 2/3 Republican in the Wisconsin House and Senate. They are moving to impeach a judge who ran in the election and said that she was against gerrymandering and for abortion rights. Her opponent had said he was for gerrymandering and against abortion rights. And she said she was against gerrymandering and for abortion rights. They're moving to impeach her, and she has yet to hear a single case. This is not a judiciary. This is a essentially unelected third political body. And then let's talk about American democracy. Let's talk about the Electoral College. Twice in this century, the person who lost the popular vote became president. I would argue, in both cases, with pretty disastrous results. I mean, it's quite clear that if we had the popular vote in 2000, we would have gotten rid of the national debt, and there would be no Iraq War. And the Afghanistan war might have gotten quite differently. We would have a rather different country. So this is not a small point. And there would have been, I think it would have been very hard for the argument that somehow the 2020 election was stolen if it was popular vote. It is only the particular mischief that's caused by the Electoral College. What is the Electoral College? You know, we in Vermont have 3 times the vote of somebody in California because we get 3 electors because we have 2 senators and 1 representative, whereas every Californian essentially has 1 elector for their 1 representative, and the 2 senators are a little small adding. But the truth is, neither of us have any influence whatsoever. Because what matters in the election is not the states that are solidly Democratic or solidly Republican. It's the states that are right at the margin, the swing states. So the Electoral College is something that disenfranchises 80% of the American people. And it produces bad results, and it allows something like 2020 to make the argument that somehow the election was stolen. Incidentally, I thought Trump was some kind of genius. I don't understand why people can think he's such a great genius when he controlled the White House, he controlled the Congress, he controlled the governors in Arizona, he controlled the legislatures in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and he still allowed the Democrats to steal? I mean, that just seems to be such incompetence that it ought to be disqualified. The second problem, finally, you've referred to my father as here as one of the inaugural lectures. One of the lessons I have from his that you've got to work in finally or in conclusion into your speech a number of times. It gives the audience hope. So finally, there's another problem. We have a political culture that places such a premium on power. And for me, it's really hard to understand. I've been in public office, both appointed and elected, and I tell you, I loved it. But I entered public office to do something. And I cannot understand people who are so keen for the perks of their job that they would destroy democracy itself. Incidentally, I mean, you know, I guess I'd love to be a member of Congress or at least a senator. But it does involve going back and forth to your state, and it's not like when you get home you can sort of sit around. You've got to go all over the place. I ran for governor of Vermont. I put 40,000 miles on my car driving. It's a beautiful state, but how many times I really want to see everything from 89 and 91? Oh, okay. Okay, you got a lot of staff and so on, but geez, I get it. You want to be there, but would you really want to destroy the very thing that you believe in? And yet, this is what we have a substantial part of the Congress. And I guess I'm going to be honest here. It isn't actually a substantial part. It is one political party. It's not. There's no equivalence here. So that's one issue. Another issue is technology. In the 1980s and 90s, technology was liberating. It spread democracy. It was the fax. And when I was working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we had ideas to send fax machines behind the Iron Curtain. It was a way around state-controlled media for those who didn't want to listen to crackly shortwave radio, the Voice of America, BBC, or whatever. Well, in the 21st century, those barriers are gone. In Russia today, anybody who wants to really go know what's going on in Ukraine can do so. They can get a VPN. They can get around the censorship. They can hop in a plane and go someplace. So sure, there's state censorship, but the real problem is now with the social media and everything else is that people self-censor. They're in their own information worlds, and that's not just in Russia. That's unfortunately in the United States. So what are we going to do about all of this? That's a really short part of this lecture. The obvious answer is to vote and to run for office, but I'm not optimistic. We may be able to circumvent some of the Supreme Court problems. There's not a word in the U.S. Constitution that gives the Supreme Court the power to rule on the constitutionality of laws. Not a word. That's just precedent. It's Marbury versus Madison, 1804. But hey, if you're discarding precedent, you discard Roe v. Wade, you can discard Marbury versus Madison. And frankly, President Joe Biden has just as much a right to determine the constitutionality of a law as the Supreme Court does. And then, so that's something that could be dealt with, or even a state could ignore a Supreme Court decision. If I had been elected governor of Vermont, I would have done it if it was something that was against the U.S. Constitution and infringed on our rights here in Vermont. But I want to turn to another question. What does anybody think would have happened had the Republicans succeeded in overturning the 2020 election? What would have happened if Mike Pence had rejected the results from the contested states, and then under the Constitution, remember the Republicans still controlled the Senate that day, under the Constitution it then went to the House of Representatives to choose a president. Although the Democrats had a majority in the House, the vote in the House is not by each representative, it's by state delegations. And the Republicans had 26 state delegations. They could have chosen Donald Trump. What would the rest of us have done? Would we have simply said, oh, well, great system, what a great... No. I mean, this is, in fact, the way in which in other countries you get to civil wars. A civil war and the breakup of countries. And much of my career has been in countries that have broken up. Croatia, Yugoslavia, East Timor from Indonesia, Kurdistan, Lithuania, South Sudan. It is where a group feels that Scotland, the majority has treated them unfairly. I mean, Scotland may become independent because it was those damn English who pulled us out of the European Union, even though we voted 60% to stay. So this is a really serious moment. And finally, or in conclusion, more globally, the 1990s promised an era of democracy. But it's not just in the United States, in so many places democracy is under threat. Now, Brazil has pulled back from the brink of its authoritarian leader, but an authoritarian could now win in Argentina, India, which was once described as we were the world's most powerful democracy, and India is the world's largest democracy. But under Modi, there is systematic discrimination against Muslim citizens and all sorts of infringements on basic democratic rights, including excluding the leader of the opposition from parliament. And reshaping the judiciary in a partisan way. Just the same playbook is here. And of course, in Russia, which was a chaotic democracy in the 1990s, it's now run by a guy who has all the morals and skills of a mafia chieftain. And the hopes for democracy that were there in Tiananmen in China seem very distant. So, if the United States is no longer standing for the liberal democratic order, and I'm not saying, I think it's going to be difficult to get us there, and it's receding elsewhere, where is it going to be? Well, perhaps it's Europe. For me, there's always a sense of irony here that twice in the last century, it was the Anglo-Saxons who stood up for the world order and democracy, and it was the Germans who were the party who was against it, and now it's a sort of German-led Europe that is probably the most democratic part of the world, but Europe has been basically unwilling to shoulder its responsibilities. So, on that not entirely optimistic note, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Meg. What we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor to questions and answers for about maybe till 8:15, about a little less than a half an hour. Does that sound good? Lots of really interesting things to be thinking about. Scott has the microphone, so if someone has a question they want to ask, they can raise their hand, and one at a time you can address, is that question going to Peter? Is that question going to Meg? I'm also monitoring the Zoom. We have some members on Zoom, so I'll share their questions as well. Thank you. And then after that, I'll invite everyone to join us in the back for refreshments and a continuation of our raffle. So thank you.
Great. Thanks. And I'll be moderating a little bit. Just once you're a town moderator, you can't stop. So if you wouldn't mind by first identifying just your first name and then what's your question?
I'm Skylar. Thank you, Peter. What do you think of the prospects of states seceding from the Union or state lines being withdrawn or being redrawn?
So the question is, what do I think of the prospects of states seceding from the Union or of state lines being withdrawn? Being redrawn. The redrawing of state lines comes up in Oregon, where there's a move by the counties of Western Oregon to join, Eastern Oregon to join Idaho. They're sparsely populated and politically much more conservative. It would require the consent of the US Congress and of Oregon, which probably wouldn't give it. So I think that's a moot point. The issue of secession is actually more interesting. The Texas Republican Party affirmed the right of Texas, to leave the Union. Now, part of me says, and I have a friend here from Texas, hey guys, don't let the door hit you on the way out. When I worked for the Senate, there was a real sense of that there was a national purpose that was higher than the political party. In fact, one of the complaints that Europeans would have looking at the Americans say, you don't really have real political parties. Or Bernie Sanders would say this, Democrats and Republicans. And yet now the parties, particularly the Republican Party, has become a tribe or a cult, and that's also true of some of the right-wing parties elsewhere in the world. And you get somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, let's just have a national divorce of blue and red states. I would think that something like that could become a real possibility if democracy ends. If, for example, in 2024, Joe Biden wins by the popular vote, he wins the electoral vote, and there's an effort to contest it, and the Supreme Court somehow rules that Trump won. In short, if they had done a competent version, if they did what they attempted to do in 2020 competently in 2024, I think then you might well wonder about whether people in New England really wanted to stay in that kind of country. So
I think we have some other questions.
Yeah,
too.
I think that could be an issue.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm JJ. I'm going to be thinking of this question as I say it because I've been thinking about it this whole talk. What role, maybe this is for you, Meg, more, did slavery play in the formation of America? And was Britain's ruling to make slavery illegal at all a part in our formation as a country and a revolution? And moving forward throughout the next 200 years, we talk about a democracy, but really, to me, or to maybe many of us, it looks more like a democracy for a certain group of people, right, and leaving another group of people out.
Yep.
So how do we define democracy when such a large group of people have been disenfranchised?
Well, one historical example, because I think that was a question in the very beginning about what's the role of slavery in here, as some states were slave states and other states became free states. Vermont started out free. Massachusetts had to listen to a petition from Prince Hall to become free. it was a big question, like, can abolitionists use the Constitution? And many abolitionists said no, the Declaration is much better. And why is it much better? Because it allows for rebellion. And this is, I feel like this is what's haunting this discussion tonight. If we give up on the Constitution, we can go for armed rebellion. And that's another way to go. There were another group of abolitionists, not just Frederick Douglass, but others, who debated, are the terms of the Constitution sufficient to free this country, to free the enslaved people? And they, Frederick Douglass in particular, said, better to have a document that speaks of liberty than no document at all. In which case, if we get rid of the document that speaks of liberty, it's armed-to-armed combat. So there was a gathering of African Americans prior to the Civil War and after the Civil War. Every year, this group would get together, different groups, congregations around the country. And the question was, should we use the Constitution or not? And they debated it. And many people said, as I'm hearing, there's an element of what Peter is saying, give up on it. This is pie in the sky, don't do it. And yet, a lot of people, the majority, said, let's go with rule of law. Because if we don't have rule of law, I don't know, maybe because I'm not big with the upper body strength or the AK-47, I kind of like it. And so in answer to your question, this has been an ongoing question. Can the Constitution help us? Or is it pie in the sky? And I think rule of law, and I'm with a lot of Peter's complaints. I'm not as hard on the Supreme Court as Peter is, and I can explain if anybody wants to know. But I do think rule of law is a better way to go than warfare.
Carrie Carter, Brattleboro, Vermont. Peter, I'm glad you brought up the Electoral College, because even when I was back in high school, I thought that was the one thing about my history studies that I felt disempowered the citizenry. And I would love your comment, and you talked about the 90s, which I thought was a very hopeful era for all of us. And I'd love you to comment on two things, Reaganomics and Citizens United, and how that impacted the turn, the direction our democracy has gone in to this day.
So, in terms of Citizens United, to be honest, I think the reaction to that is been more extreme than warranted. Because the real problem was an earlier Supreme Court case, Buckley v. Vallejo. Buckley v. Vallejo said you can't regulate the amount of money somebody spends on their own campaign, and or that an individual spends. I mean, you can regulate the amount you can give to a candidate, but you can't regulate the amount that you spend on behalf of a candidate, either by the candidate or somebody else. And Citizens United said that corporations have the same rights. But the truth is, corporations are not actually doing the spending. It's individuals. It's these individual billionaires who are using the money from their corporation, but it isn't it's Bloomberg individually. I think it's the Koch brothers individually, not Koch Industries. I think that that one's been overstated. In terms of Reaganomics, well, my father described Reaganomics as the horse and sparrow theory of economics. That is to say, the idea was if you cut the first point about it was that if you cut taxes for the rich, they'll work harder. If you cut taxes for the poor or give the poor additional benefits, they'll become lazy and stop working. So, and the second thing is if you cut taxes for the rich, they're going to work harder, they'll make a bigger economy, and some of it will trickle down. That was the phrase, trickle down economics. And hence my father's phrase, the horse and sparrow theory. You feed the horse enough oats, some of it will pass through for the sparrow on the road behind the flag. But I think the larger question that the gentleman over here was asking, or point he was making, was is inequality a huge problem in this country? Absolutely. It's why when I was in the Vermont Senate, I wanted to raise the minimum wage, which I argued was both the best anti-poverty program we could have. It was also going to be good for rich people, because what happens is tax dollars go to subsidize low-wage employers like Walmart. You go to work for Walmart, and you get told how to sign up for food stamps, and you get the earned income tax credit, which comes from everybody else's tax dollars. So we have a system of huge inequality, and that's a big problem.
Okay, we have one question online. So this is from Gorgana, and they're asking, what is the speaker's position on Great Recession in 2008 and its role in the decline of the U.S.?
That's an interesting question. What was the role of the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession on U.S. standing in the world? It's hard for me to separate that out from the other events that took place in 2008. It came at the very end of the George Bush administration, and by that time, the entire world, frankly, was fed up with him. There was a sense of American arrogance. There was the disaster in Iraq. Things in Afghanistan weren't going well. And so in 2008, you had Barack Obama win. And whatever you may think of him, I personally think very highly of him, but maybe not everybody does. But whatever you may think of him, his election was welcomed all over the world. And so I think at the same time as the fiscal crisis was taking place, there was a real sense that the United States could reclaim its leadership. In fact, so much so that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I think he himself said, do I really deserve this? And did I just get the Nobel Peace Prize for not being George Bush?
Peter, do you think he made a mistake bailing out Goldman Sachs?
You think?
I'm curious what you think about that element of it, Peter.
Well, first, the people who bailed out the banks was actually the Bush administration. And I remember that vividly because I was doing some campaigning for Obama, and I'd gone through Washington. I went out to speak to the Croat community and Croatian Americans in Pittsburgh. And, they were a very conservative group, and I had the headline of the Washington Post, which was U.S. nationalizes parts of, 8 banks, and I think it included Goldman Sachs and so on. And I looked at the number and I said, George Bush, a bigger communist than Lenin. He nationalized assets of more value than Lenin did. That was a cute rhetorical point. Probably didn't win Obama any votes. But anyhow, but that was all done by the Bush administration. Do I think saving the banks was a good idea? I suppose I do. A lot of these bailouts actually made money for the U.S. and the U.S. took ownership of the auto companies, and then as they recovered, it sold the shares, and that was a nice profit to the taxpayers.
I'm going to try to focus. That last point about the economics, I think that's wrong. I think as a graduate of University of Massachusetts Economics Department, the little people suffered and became a lot of the mortgage whole situation, and people were not held accountable. Okay, the impact of George W. Bush, his brainlessness. I was watching CNN.
Question.
All right, when history measures or evaluates George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, I think the fact that our country no longer has the standard of education that we had when I was growing up, and I've lost my savings trying to reproduce that for my children. Fortunately, the Rockefellers.
Question.
So,
We're looking for a question
okay.
here, and I'm sure you got
So
one.
what in your estimation would be the impact of George W. Bush? The fact that he just completely did not have the intelligence or leadership in this country, the long-term.
Great. It
Yeah,
looks like what you're
whatever.
asking for is
I saw
a
him on
historical.
CNN.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing.
Question.
CNN,
No, you asked the question, answer.
Jimmy Carter speech, and then George W. Bush after Iraq. Ego.
Let's give
Let
Peter.
me-
Let's give Peter a chance to respond.
So,
I know, I'm just so overwhelmed.
an appraisal of George W. Bush, I think one of the great mistakes that people have made about him is to say he was stupid. I think he lacked curiosity, and that's what people who know him said. But I don't think he was actually stupid. He claimed to be the decider, but I wrote a book about this on Iraq, but he actually never asked the kind of questions that needed to be decided, like what would happen once U.S. troops got to Baghdad. That was not worked out. So, his legacy is fundamentally about Iraq. That defined his presidency. I want to just respond to one of your points about people not being held accountable. I certainly agree with that. To say that it was the right thing to keep the major banks of the United States from going bankrupt is not to say that that those who are responsible for bringing them to the verge of bankruptcy should not have been sanctioned, investigated, indicted, and imprisoned for, if there was criminal conduct, which I believe there was. There was significant fraud there. So all of that should have happened, but that's a separate question from what would have been the economic consequences of allowing the American banking system to collapse.
My name is Breeze, T. Breeze Verdant. I've had the thoughts, I've had many people mention that this country could be heading towards civil war.
We are.
One of the things I don't hear ever talked about is the fact that one side of the way this war would split has a lot of weapons. The other side does not. I do not ever hear that spoken about. I wonder if either one of you
Thank you. Yeah.
would care to comment.
Well, there are all sorts of ways in which the Civil War may develop, which are not going to depend on, who has the most guns, the breakup of a country may not even be violent. Let's just imagine that in 2024 you have a replay of 2020, except Biden wins by 7 million votes. They're the 3 contested states, and the whole issue goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules that the state legislatures can overturn the results. Probably won't, but let's say something like that happened, or the Republicans win the House and the Senate, and they reject the results. Which is, I guess, more likely, that they reject the results of the election. It then goes to election by the House of Representatives voting by state. And that's upheld by the Supreme Court. Then what does a guy like Joe Biden do? You can't accept that result. So, even if he wanted to, you can't accept it. So he, I presume, would say, no, I won the election, I won the Electoral College, I'm going to continue to be president. And it would then be decided by what the military agreed to do. It's a terrible situation for a democracy to begin, and goes against all the things and I taught at the National Defense University, the National War College. Guards against everything that military officers are trained to do. Imagine that Donald Trump, that the results have been elected in 2020. Would the military have accepted that Donald Trump continue another term? That's tough.
Can I offer a slightly different perspective?
Please.
And it's one that won't involve weapons. This comes from Rachel Kleinfeld, who has written an article last year, 5 Strategies to Support Democracy. And what she said, and this really struck me, again, I'm going to be looking for other ways to think about resolving problems than using violence. And what she said is that what happens when you have a supermajority and the minority is not allowed a place at the table, that what tends to happen is you get political violence and criminal violence. Yeah. So I understand that on a federalist perspective. I am concerned in supermajority red states when Democrats, progressives, sexual minorities do not get a place at the table. I am equally concerned, and this may be something that doesn't get said in Windham County, but in Vermont, where you have a supermajority of progressives and people with religious liberties are not tolerated. And that's when you start to see a buildup of political violence. So what I'm hoping is that people want to come out and have conversations about this, that we truly allow people who are political minorities in our community to have a seat at the table, and that we learn how to listen and respond with respect, because otherwise with this sorting that's happening, what I'm concerned about is the rise of political violence with political minorities in red and blue states.
I of course agree with that, but not commenting on the specific issue in Vermont, but the problem that I'm discussing is not the treatment of a political minority. I'm talking about the problem of the political majority being denied power, having won an election. Right. That's an entirely different problem.
So we have a person in the back, because I'm watching the time, 8:15, we're going to come to an end. This may be our last question.
We'll have 2 more. I'm just going to do a little bit of equity and share the floor with the rear section of the sanctuary.
Great. Okay, speak from the rear.
There we go. You've spoken about democracy this evening. As the Action Corps Vermont organizer, I'm interested to know if you think additional weapons and security guarantees for Saudi Arabia, which has used these weapons to massacre Ethiopian migrants and continues to maintain a devastating blockade in Yemen, if that is a good modeling of our democracy, if it's a gainful path for the U.S. to continue on. Thank you.
But could I add, as a diplomat, how I feel about inviting, having an American resident and journalists come into your consulate and be cut up into little pieces? I mean, Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman has many of the qualities of Saddam Hussein, but nobody wants to make that comparison. And this is a guy who has launched this disastrous war in Lebanon. He ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in this brutal manner. Wasn't clever enough to even get it covered up. Realized what the Turkish intelligence agencies could do, Turkish intelligence agencies. He invited the Prime Minister of Lebanon to Saudi Arabia, then arrested him, forced him to resign. He then went home and became Prime Minister again. He impulsively, he bought a painting that might be a Da Vinci for $500 million. He shook down members of the royal family. How anybody can say that this guy is a potential reliable ally is absolutely beyond me. Is there one more question? Please.
Yeah. Is this on? Okay, thanks. Perhaps this is a good last question, because what I'd like you both to comment on, what are the possibilities that we transcend the nation state? Are we heading as a global civilization, as a world threatened by climate change, with our very survival? What are the prospects that we, the people, come together not within a nation framework, but under a more global framework in the years ahead?
You want to go first?
Well, the Constitution wrangler can't use the Constitution for that kind of imaginative exploration. Those kinds of transformative, moving beyond the nation state to something more universal has generally been the province of religions. And that'll be an interesting piece, that maybe world religions could come together on this issue, and that would be a way of transcending the nation state.
Let me say a couple of things in conclusion. First, I wanted to come back to the issue of rule of law versus violence. I think, obviously everybody's against violence. The problem you have is when those who are responsible for the rule of law are themselves lawless.
Yes.
And this is not my point, it's a friend of mine who's a federal judge who's describing that problem with the judiciary, particularly at its top. So that's one problem. The second issue, when you're describing transnational governance, don't call it government, governance, that is actually happening. Now, there are transnational governments. The best example is, of course, the European Union. It's not a treaty of whatever it is, 27 countries. It is a federal union, like the United States. It has a constitution, it has a parliament, it has a judiciary. Within the powers of the European Union law is superior to the law of its constituent states, just like the US. In some areas of law, Brussels has more power than Washington, vis-a-vis its constituent components. But beyond that, and there are a variety of regional institutions that are like that. There's the Organization of the American States, there's the Organization of African Union, the African Union, used to be the Organization of African Unity, but now it's just the African Union. There is ASEAN, that's there. But the other real point is the extraordinary role of the United Nations in global governance. And by saying the United Nations, I don't just mean, the building in New York where the General Assembly and Security Council. I mean the whole system of it, which regulates so much of our lives in ways that we don't realize it. Aviation. Responding to the global environmental challenges, maritime issues, maritime dumping, and biodiversity. There are a huge number of things, but it operates in another way, I think, that people don't realize. In fact, it took me a long time to understand it as well. The General Assembly passes all these resolutions, and environment, women's issues, all that stuff. And I was there when it was happening in the 1980s. I thought, nice little resolution, but kind of like a resolution of the US Congress, doesn't mean anything. On the contrary, because what they are doing is establishing global norms. And the advance of women throughout the world is in fact a result of norms that were established in New York, in the United Nations, through the Third Committee, and then through the General Assembly. And there are just so many other environmental issues, rights of the child, prohibitions on torture, everything about us, I'm not even doing a very good job of getting a complete list, is there. And the answer is, as we deal with, we have two challenges that might cause our extinction. And let's not forget about nuclear weapons. We act as if that's all gone. No, that's still there. But there is also climate. And there's no way that can be addressed by any country alone. It has to be done globally. And this was one of the issues I had when I was in the Vermont Senate. I was like, Vermont is not going to solve this problem by itself. It isn't, unfortunately, it's not Planet Vermont. It requires a global solution, and we just all have to be part of that. And incidentally, it's coming. It's coming because companies want to do business in Europe. Right. Multinationals. Here we can be grateful for them. They have to meet European standards. Norway has banned electric cars, new electric cars, I think as of 5 years from now, 2020, maybe it's as soon as 2025. Well, other countries are doing that. So, no matter how much everybody wants the gas guzzlers in this country, all the car makers are going to be making electric cars. And there are just many examples like that that are the positive side of globalization. I don't want to say it's negative, but there are these global norms, and it is the way in which our world operates. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.